Hi everyone, welcome back. Have you ever noticed how, when you're trying to wrap your head around a really tough concept, you kind of instinctively reach for a comparison? This new thing is kind of like that thing I already understand.
Oh, yeah, for sure. It's like our brains are wired to make those connections.
Exactly. So today we're going to dive into this awesome idea called Analogical Modeling Competence, or AMC. It's basically your ability to use those comparisons, those analogies, to make sense of science. And we've got some really cool research here, a bunch of studies actually, that look at what AMC really is and why it's so important for, not just learning science, but also for teaching it effectively.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff. You've shared some studies that get into the nitty-gritty of how AMC develops, how we can measure it, and what it can tell us about how, especially younger students, they focused on sixth graders learning about electricity, how they use analogies to learn.
Perfect. So our goal today is to really dig into these studies, pull out the key insights about AMC, and figure out, how we can figure out someone's AMC and what that tells us about how students make sense of science through analogies.
Sounds like a plan.
Awesome. So let's jump right in. First off, why is understanding AMC such a big deal for teachers?
Well, one of the huge things for teachers is that this research actually provides a way to assess a student's AMC. It's like this incredible tool that lets teachers peek into how their students are using analogies in science.
Oh, that's so interesting. So it's like a window into their thinking. Can it help teachers see not just that a student is struggling, but why?
Exactly.
Because, the research talks about these, they use kind of technical terms, phenomenon-related abductive premises or phenomenon ABPR, and then analogical modeling processes or AMP. So in plain English, what do those actually tell a teacher about their students?
Okay, let's demystify those terms. Phenomenon APR is really about how well a student understands the basic science idea they're trying to explain with an analogy. Like before they even try to find a comparison, do they actually grasp the core concept?
Okay, so it's their foundation, their starting point.
Right. And then AMP, on the other hand, is all about the process of actually using the analogy. Can they pick a good comparison? Can they see how the different parts of that analogy connect to the scientific idea? Can they actually use it to, explain something new or solve a problem?
So it's like they need both the solid foundation and the skills to build on it.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And so if a teacher sees, a lot of their students struggling with the phenomenon ABPR part, it might mean they need to go back and, revisit the scientific concept itself. Maybe there's some gaps in their understanding there. But if the issue is more on the AMP side, then it could be that they need more practice and support in the skill of actually using analogies effectively.
That's so helpful for a teacher to know where to focus their efforts. And it seems like understanding a student's AMC can give teachers this much deeper view into how well they actually grasp a scientific idea. Like you mentioned with those sixth graders learning about electricity, it's not just about knowing the definition of a circuit, it's about truly understanding how it works.
You got it. Because with this AMC assessment, students are asked to create their own analogies, right? That's much more revealing than just answering multiple choice questions. It shows a much richer picture of their understanding.
Right. It's like they're showing their work, their thought process.
Exactly. So for instance, if a student's trying to explain how a circuit works and they come up with an analogy, the type of analogy they choose and how they explain those connections, those relationships, tells the teacher a lot. It reveals whether they really get the idea of a closed loop, the flow of electricity, or if they're just, listing components without a real understanding of how they interact.
That's so powerful. And having this deeper level of insight into their understanding or where they're misunderstanding things, that must be so valuable for teachers in planning their lessons, right? It lets them tailor their teaching to address those specific issues.
Absolutely. Let's say a teacher notices a lot of students are having trouble with the application part of AMP. Meaning they can't really use their analogy to explain a new situation or solve a problem. That's a signal to the teacher that they might need to focus on providing more diverse examples and really walking students through how to apply analogies in different contexts.
Oh, that makes total sense. It's like giving them the tools and practice to really use analogies as a thinking skill, not just a memorization trick.
Right.
The research also pointed out that thankfully, this AMC assessment is pretty practical for teachers to use. It's a paper and pencil format, which is a huge plus for busy classrooms.
Oh, for sure. It's easy to administer. No fancy technology or one-on-one interviews needed.
Right, it's accessible.
Exactly. Teachers can get a good snapshot of the whole class's analogical thinking without a ton of extra work.
Yeah.
And because the assessment is based on this really well-defined framework, it helps teachers track how their students' ability to use analogies develops over time.
Yeah, the research talked about these different levels of understanding, right? From not really getting the analogy at all to having this really deep and insightful understanding of both the science concept and the analogy itself. So a teacher can see not just if a student is using an analogy, but how well they're using it and then track their growth.
Precisely. These levels give teachers a way to see that progression of analogical thinking. So a student at a lower level might have an analogy that doesn't really fit the science very well, or they might miss some key connections.
Like a square peg in a round hole.
Yeah, kind of. But then a student at a higher level, they'll show a much more sophisticated understanding of how the analogy and the science connect. Their explanation will be more detailed, and they'll be able to use it in more complex ways.
So it gives the teacher these milestones to work with.
Yeah, exactly. It helps them set realistic goals for their students and then actually see meaningful progress as they develop their analogical thinking skills.
I was also really interested by this idea of a structural mapping table. It's described as a way to map out the relationships within a scientific model, a kind of relationship roadmap. How does that work, and how can it help teachers?
Oh, the structural mapping table is a really cool tool. Think of it as a way to visually lay out the science concept and the analogy side by side, so you can clearly see how the different parts connect.
So it's not just, this is like that. It's showing the how and the why of the comparison.
Yeah, exactly. And it helps teachers guide their students to think more deeply about those connections. Why is this part of the analogy relevant? How does it map onto this specific part of the scientific concept? It gives them a common language to analyze the strengths and weaknesses of an analogy and to really understand the underlying relationships.
So it's a tool for deepening the analysis, going beyond the surface level of the analogy.
Exactly. And that deeper analysis can then help teachers in a bunch of ways. It can help them choose more effective analogies to use in their own teaching, and it can help them better understand and evaluate the analogies that their students come up with.
Oh, that's interesting. So they can kind of spot the flaws in a student's analogy and then use that to guide them towards a more accurate understanding.
Right. They can see which parts of the analogy are helpful and which parts might be misleading or incomplete. It's like a diagnostic tool, but for analogies.
It sounds like having a good grasp of AMC also helps teachers tap into what their students already know, which is the foundation of good teaching, right? Building on their prior knowledge.
Absolutely. When teachers understand their students' ability to use analogies and what they already know about the science topic, they can choose analogies that are going to resonate with their students. They can use comparisons that connect to their students' existing knowledge and experiences, which makes the learning process much more meaningful.
It's like building a bridge from the familiar to the new.
Exactly. And the research suggested that using those phenomenon ABPR questions, those questions about the core concept before introducing the analogy, those can be super helpful for teachers when they're combined with other ways of checking for understanding.
Right, so it's not meant to be the only assessment tool.
Not at all. It's most effective when it's used alongside other things, like classroom discussions, experiments, other types of questions. It's all about getting a complete picture of how students are thinking and learning.
So it's like a piece of the puzzle, but an important piece.
Definitely.
Finally, being able to compare how students do on this AMC assessment before and after a lesson, that just seems like such a practical way for teachers to evaluate their own teaching methods, especially if they're trying out new ways to incorporate analogies into their lessons.
Oh, yeah, for sure. It gives them concrete data on whether their efforts to help students develop their analogical thinking skills are actually having an impact.
It's like a feedback loop for the teacher.
Yeah, it lets them see what's working, what's not, and adjust accordingly.
Okay, so we've talked about how understanding AMC can be really helpful for teachers, but what about for the students themselves? How does getting better at this, at using analogies, actually benefit them in learning science?
Well, for students, getting good at AMC means they're developing a crucial skill for doing science. It's about going beyond just memorizing facts and learning how to think like a scientist, how to make connections, how to explain things. And analogies are such a powerful tool for all of that.
It's like they're learning to think critically and creatively about science.
Exactly.
And the research talked about how having students generate their own analogies, that's a big part of AMC. And that really encourages creative thinking. It helps them come up with their own explanations and even make new discoveries in science. They're not just passively absorbing information.
It's so true. When students are challenged to come up with their own comparisons to explain a scientific idea, they have to really engage with the material, think about it in new ways, and be creative.
They have to own it.
Yeah, and that can lead to those aha moments, those moments of deep understanding and connection that make learning so exciting.
The research also mentioned how when students create an analogy, that's like a model they're building, and that helps them make their thinking visible both to themselves and to their teachers.
Right. When a student explains their analogy, they're essentially externalizing their thought process.
They're putting it out there.
Yeah, and that helps them reflect on their own understanding, like, does this make sense? Does it hold up? And it gives teachers a clearer window into how the student is thinking so they can give more targeted feedback.
So it's a win-win. And for those really tough abstract science concepts, like we keep coming back to electricity, using those familiar analogies can be such a great bridge to understanding.
Oh, absolutely. Analogies take those abstract, sometimes invisible scientific concepts and ground them in everyday experiences that students already understand.
They make it relatable.
Exactly. Think about using the idea of water flowing through pipes to explain how electricity flows through wires. It gives them a concrete image to work with, something they can visualize.
Right, it's like a mental model.
Yeah.
But importantly, working with analogies also helps students realize that these comparisons, they have their limits, they're not perfect.
Oh, that's so important. No analogy is perfect, and knowing where an analogy breaks down, where it stops being helpful, is just as important as knowing where it works.
So it's about being critical of the analogy, not just accepting it blindly.
Exactly. And this helps students develop a more nuanced and sophisticated understanding of scientific models in general. They learn that models are tools, and like all tools, they have their strengths and weaknesses, their limitations.
That's such an important takeaway for understanding science. And the AMC framework, it's designed to give students practice in all the different parts of using analogies. From first understanding the science concept, to choosing an analogy, to building it, testing it, applying it, even adapting it if it's not working. It's a whole process.
It's a comprehensive approach. Students learn to not just come up with any old comparison, but to really think carefully about which analogy is most appropriate, how to build it effectively, how to check if it fits the science, how to analyze its strengths and weaknesses, how to apply it in new situations, and even how to change it if it's not quite right.
So they're learning to be flexible and adaptable.
Exactly.
And all of that practice with analogies, that really helps build their reasoning skills in general, right?
Absolutely. By actively mapping out the relationships between the analogy and the science concept, they get better at seeing similarities and differences. They get better at making logical connections, at drawing inferences.
It's like they're exercising their brains.
That's a great way to put it.
And ultimately, getting better at this, at AMC, it makes it much more likely that students will be able to use analogies on their own as a learning tool in the classroom and beyond.
Definitely. When they're comfortable and skilled with analogies, they have this powerful tool they can use whenever they encounter new information or when they're trying to solve problems in science. It makes them more independent learners, which is what we want.
It empowers them.
Exactly.
And the research also highlighted how just the process of trying to come up with an analogy can make students think more deeply about the science itself.
Oh, for sure. To come up with a good analogy, a good comparison, students really have to wrestle with the core concepts, understand the relationships, and try to explain it in a different way.
It's like they have to really, really get it in order to explain it to someone else.
Exactly. And that process of trying to explain it can solidify their own understanding. It can also help them figure out where they're still confused, where they need more clarification.
Take a self-check.
Yeah.
And then realizing that their first analogy might not be perfect, that they might need to revise it, that's also a super valuable lesson, right? Like, science understanding is not fixed. It can change.
Right. It teaches them that science is a process. It's about constantly refining our understanding. Models and analogies, they're not the end point, they're starting points. We can always learn more, make our models better, and get a clearer understanding of how things work.
So it fosters that growth mindset in science.
Absolutely.
This has been so helpful in understanding how AMC benefits both teachers and students. Now, let's shift gears a bit and talk about how this framework and this whole idea of assessing AMC can help educational researchers. It seems like it gives them a much more precise way to look at how analogies are used in science learning.
Yeah, definitely. For researchers, the AMC framework offers a really detailed and structured way to investigate this complex process of using analogies in science education. Breaking it down into those specific components we talked about, the phenomenon ABPR and the AMP, That allows researchers to ask much more focused research questions and really get to the heart of how analogical thinking works.
Right, it's like they're zooming in.
Exactly.
And then breaking down the AMP further into those 5 stages, choosing the analogy, checking how well it fits, analyzing its strengths and weaknesses, applying it in new situations, and adapting it when necessary, that gives researchers a really clear roadmap for studying how students actually use analogies in practice.
Absolutely. That level of detail provides a common language for researchers. They can all talk about the same thing using the same terms.
It standardizes the research.
Exactly. And it provides this theoretical foundation for designing studies, analyzing data, and comparing findings across different studies about different aspects of analogical thinking. It really helps advance the field.
The study also emphasized this very meticulous construct-based approach that they use to develop and validate the AMC assessment.
Oh yeah, that's a huge contribution.
It sounds like a really important process for researchers who are trying to measure complex skills like this.
It is. The researchers laid out all the steps involved in this approach. From first defining the construct, which is basically, what does this skill actually look like?
Right.
To designing specific questions to assess it, to figuring out how to score student responses, and then using some sophisticated statistics to make sure the assessment is actually measuring what it's supposed to. It's a really rigorous process.
It's like building a super precise instrument.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. And this gives other researchers a solid methodology that they can use or adapt for their own work. It helps ensure that their research is high quality and that their findings are valid and reliable.
The study also mentioned how they used concept maps of electricity and those structural mapping tables during the development process to make sure everything was aligned. It seems like that would be a really useful technique for anyone designing assessments, not just for analogical thinking, but for any complex skill.
For sure. Those tools helped the researchers make sure that there was a strong connection between, their ideas about how students use analogies, the actual questions they were asking on the assessment, and how they were interpreting the students' answers. It ensures that the assessment is really getting at what it's supposed to.
It's like everything is connected, everything is intentional.
Precisely.
And the assessment they developed, it allows researchers to actually quantify students' AMC, put a number on it, which can be really challenging with more qualitative research methods.
Yeah, that's a big advantage. And the fact that it's in a paper and pencil format, which is good for teachers because it's practical. It's also good for researchers because it allows them to collect data from a lot more students.
Right, it's scalable.
Exactly. And that leads to more robust findings that can be generalized to a larger population of students.
And the study itself provided some interesting insights into how those 6th graders were doing with the concept of electricity. I think you mentioned earlier that they were better at validating an analogy, like checking if it fit, but they had more trouble applying it to new situations.
Yeah, that was a key finding. And that kind of baseline data is so valuable for the field because it gives us a starting point for understanding how these skills typically develop at that age and how they might change with instruction or over time.
So it's like a benchmark.
Exactly.
And the researchers also looked at the correlation between actually understanding electricity and a student's AMC, and they found a moderate link there. So it's not a one-to-one relationship, which is interesting.
Right. It suggests that while you do need to have some understanding of the science concept to be able to use analogies effectively, it's also a separate skill in itself.
Okay, so you can't just rely on your science knowledge. You have to develop the analogical thinking skills too.
Exactly. You could have a student who understands the science pretty well, but still struggles with the process of creating and using analogies.
Or the other way around.
Yeah. And that really highlights that AMC is this distinct and important skill to cultivate.
It deserves its own attention.
Definitely.
And of course, having a way to assess AMC allows researchers to investigate how effective different teaching methods are at actually improving this skill.
Oh, absolutely. Researchers can use this assessment to see if, for example, students' analogical thinking improves after they've been taught with a particular strategy or curriculum that's specifically designed to boost these skills. And that helps us figure out what teaching approaches are most effective for promoting this kind of deep understanding.
It's evidence-based teaching in action.
Exactly.
Now, the study also acknowledged that, trying to assess a complex skill, like using analogies, it's not easy.
For sure.
But by openly talking about the challenges, it kind of helps move the field forward, right?
Absolutely. Recognizing the difficulties and discussing them openly. That encourages other researchers to think critically about their own methods, their assumptions, their limitations. It pushes the field to keep searching for better, more accurate ways to understand and measure analogical thinking.
It keeps everyone honest.
Right.
And so by defining and operationalizing this concept of AMC, this research really helps build a stronger theoretical foundation for understanding this whole process of how we learn science through analogy.
Yes. It provides a framework and a set of tools that researchers can build on.
It gives them a place to start.
Exactly.
Now, just to clarify one thing before we wrap up, how is this AMC assessment different from a typical science test that a student might take in school?
That's a great question. So the AMC assessment is much more focused. It's specifically designed to measure a student's ability to create and use analogical models in science. That's its primary goal.
So while a general science test might ask about a whole range of things like definitions, concepts, experiments, problem solving, the AMC assessment zeroes in on the specific skill of using analogies.
Exactly. General science tests cover a much broader range of content and skills. The AMC assessment, on the other hand, it really hones in on the mental processes involved in using analogies. Things like making connections, drawing inferences, evaluating the quality of an analogy, and seeing how well students can apply those analogies to different situations.
Okay, that makes sense. And finally, let's get back to the specifics of that study with the sixth graders learning about electricity. They used this idea of students self-generating their analogies. What did that look like in practice?
So instead of giving students a ready-made analogy to work with, the assessment questions were designed to prompt them to come up with their own comparisons to explain the concepts of electricity.
So it's like, okay, here's this idea about circuits. How can you explain that using an analogy?
Exactly. And that really taps into their creativity and their ability to connect what they already know to this new scientific idea. It requires a deeper level of processing than just, matching terms or filling in the blanks.
Right. It's more challenging.
Yes.
And as we discussed, the study looked at both phenomenon ABPR and AMP, and they analyzed the student responses at those different levels of sophistication, right?
I did. It was a very detailed analysis. They weren't just looking at whether or not the students could come up with an analogy. They were also looking at how well they understood the underlying concepts of electricity and how complex and appropriate their chosen analogy was at different stages of the process.
So they were really trying to unpack their thinking.
Exactly.
And this study involved a pretty good sample size, almost 300 students, and they used that rigorous construct-based approach to develop and test the assessment. Overall, it seems like the results showed that the assessment worked pretty well.
They did.
What were some of the key findings about how these students did?
Well, one interesting finding was that the students generally did better on those phenomenon AVPR questions, those questions about the basic science concept when it came to simple circuits. But they struggled a bit more with the questions about electric energy, which is a more abstract concept.
That makes sense. Energy is harder to visualize.
Yeah. And then, when it came to actually using analogies, most of the students were able to make those basic connections between their analogy and the scientific idea.
Yeah.
They could see the basic similarity.
So they were on the right track.
Yeah, they were. But they had a much harder time applying their analogy to explain a new situation or to recognize the limitations of their analogy, where it might break down or not be a perfect fit.
Which, again, highlights the need to focus on those higher-level skills, like application and analysis.
Absolutely. It's not enough to just see the surface-level connections. They need to be able to use the analogy as a tool for thinking.
Right, to really push their understanding.
Yeah.
The study also mentioned that they used those concept maps of electricity and the structural mapping tables to help connect the science concepts to the analogies that the students came up with.
Right.
Those seem like really valuable tools, not just for the assessment itself, but maybe even for teaching about electricity.
Absolutely. So the concept maps help to really clearly define the key ideas and the relationships within the concept of electricity, which helped ensure that the assessment questions were actually targeting the right concepts. And then the structural mapping tables, those provided a way to systematically analyze the quality of the students' analogies by comparing the features of their analogy to the features of the actual scientific concept.
So they were like guidelines for making sure the analogies were on point.
Exactly.
And despite the detailed nature of the assessment, using the paper and tinsel format seemed to work well in the classroom setting.
Yeah, it was practical and efficient. And they even provided the students with a little bit of reading material beforehand to explain what an analogy is, just to make sure everyone was on the same page.
Oh, that's a good idea, to give them a common starting point.
Exactly. And they use that example, I think you mentioned it earlier, of like soldiers protecting a country being analogous to white blood cells protecting the body.
Right. It's a really clear example.
Yeah.
And then the way they scored the student responses, having separate ways to score their understanding of the science and the quality of their analogy, that seemed like a really important part of getting meaningful data from this assessment.
It was. It allowed the researchers to capture both aspects of AMC. How well do they understand the science concept, and how sophisticated is their analogical thinking? And the fact that they found a moderate correlation between those two scores that further supports the idea that these are related but distinct skills.
It's like a Venn diagram with some overlap, but also separate circles.
Exactly. And then another interesting finding was that the AMP items, those items that asked students to actually use analogies, those were generally more difficult for the students than the phenomenon ABPR items, those questions that just focused on their understanding of the science concept.
So again, using analogies is a higher level skill.
Yeah.
And the assessment tool as a whole seemed to be pretty reliable.
It did.
They also found that the students, as we've been discussing, were better at using analogies for simple circuits, but they struggled more when it came to the concept of energy.
Right.
And the researchers suggested that teachers might want to use those structural mapping tables to help students discuss and analyze the relationships within different models, which seems like a really practical takeaway.
That's a great suggestion. It gives students a concrete tool for making those connections visible and really understanding the how and the why of the analogy.
And finally, that observation that the students could often identify weaknesses in their own analogies, but they didn't always know how to fix them, that really highlights an important area for future teaching.
Absolutely. It suggests that while students might develop some awareness of the limitations of their analogies, they often need more explicit guidance and instruction on how to revise and refine them.
So it's not just about recognizing the problem, it's about knowing what to do about it.
Exactly.
Well, this has been a truly fascinating deep dive into analogical modeling competence. I feel like we've learned so much.
Me too.
To sum it all up for you, dear listener, AMC is a really important skill for learning science, and the AMC assessment gives us valuable tools for understanding and measuring that skill.
It gives us insights into how students think.
And understanding AMC can really help teachers refine their teaching methods and better support their students in developing a deeper, more intuitive grasp of science.
And a more joyful one, hopefully.
Absolutely. So here's something to think about. How could a focus on developing students' analogical thinking skills, maybe even using tools like the AMC assessment or the principles behind it, how could that transform science education and lead to deeper understanding for all learners? And on a personal note, what analogies do you find most helpful when you're trying to make sense of complex topics, not just in science, but in life? It's something to ponder as we wrap up this deep dive.
Great question. I'll be thinking about that one myself.
Me too. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It's been fun.
Until next time.
Bye.
Bye.